Hello, Dr. Miaken here from Zeigler Chiropractic, and I first want to thank you for joining me today in the conversation that we're about to have. And I know that it took time for you to be here, maybe even rearranged your schedule so that you could commit to the next 25, 30 minutes of engaging and understanding how epigenetics impact your health and expression of life. And really the question is, do your genes determine your life? It once was thought that that was the case, and now we're finding through the study of epigenetics, which we'll get to in a second, that's not the case, which is really wonderful and empowering. And so as you sit with this conversation tonight, I just ask that you start the conversation with being open to receiving the information. It is with an open hand, open heart and an open mind that we can grow. And my goal for you is to grow and move in the spectrum of health and disease. My goal is for you to move into this health spectrum, and the more consistent you are with the choices that you make, can continue to put you into this health realm, which can really change your trajectory in life, change where you are 5, 10, 30 years down the road, and change that of your family. Because when you start making choices that uplift your health and well-being, guess what? Your family is watching. They are also starting to make those same decisions. So grateful that you've joined me today, and know that I am prepared and promise to deliver a conversation that end goal in mind to support your health and well-being. So let's get started. So I'm going to share my screen. This is the what we're going to be referencing today in the conversation around epigenetics, and do my genes in fact determine what my life is. And I guess I'll start with, your genes do not predetermine, but they predispose you to health impacts and how you respond to stress. But before we go there, let's just define epigenetics. And really, epigenetics is the study in the field of genetics, and looking at the variation of genetics and cell and physiological changes and trait variations that are caused from environmental factors, which can turn genes on or off, which can upregulate genes or downregulate genes in your DNA sequencing. And those genes can be inflammatory, those genes can be anti-inflammatory, they can be genes that support a health state, genes that support a disease state. So really understanding how your environment can impact and predispose you to conditions is really valuable. Because when we look at the research, what we're finding is that there are 5-10% of true genetic conditions. That is sickle cell anemia, that is type 1 diabetes, that is Down syndrome. Everything else outside of this 5-10% are lifestyle conditions. I've got people who come into me and share that, migraines or headaches run in my family. Alcoholism runs in my family. We have arthritis that runs in my family. Well, what we're finding with the study of epigenetics is that it's not that you have this genetic coding and genetic sequencing that equals headache, migraine, arthritis, alcoholism. It's that the choices that you make consistently over time turn this sequencing on or turn sequencing off to express a specific way your body is responding and showing health or the lack thereof. So when you say headaches run in my family, understand, we look at epigenetics and how lifestyle impact our genetic sequencing, know that how grandmother lived, the choices she made, the belief systems she had, the foods that she ate, how she carried herself was likely similar to how mom lives, right? As children, we are watching our parents and we are doing as they do, not always doing as they say. And we have very similar belief systems, very similar lifestyle choices, very similar actions and activities that we continue to pass down generation to generation. And in fact, I was listening in to a Monica Berger seminar, and she was presenting research that indicated that our genetic expression goes back 14 generations. You heard me right, 14 generations. So the way you're choosing to live today, in this moment, the choices you make, the belief systems that you have, the thoughts, they are impacting 14 generations on. And so I think it's worth this conversation to really understand how epigenetics and your lifestyle choices can impact your expression of health. So let's just back up here and we'll follow along on this handout that I have. But let's look at DNA, all right? So we know DNA make up the coding for our genetic expression. So imagine a ladder or a zipper, and it is twisted in a spiral. And our DNA is the raw information or instructions that make us who we are and what we are. Each half of the DNA contain corresponding nucleic acids that together make pairs, and they number around 3 billion per cell. So groups of long sequences of these nucleic acids are called genes, okay? Now, these genes, this long spiral of zipper of raw data, of raw information that makes up who we are and what we are, they produce proteins. Now, proteins are the materials that our body uses to construct on our physical anatomy, but also the functions and complex interactions that take place through our physiology. Okay, so proteins control our immune system, they digest our food, they heal our wounds and injuries, they catalyze chemical reactions, they support our structural integrity of our bodies, they provide molecules to communicate between cells, and so much more. Everything. Proteins are what make up our physical anatomy and our intricate functions and interactions that make up our physiology. Now, there was a major research project called the Human Genome Project, and they anticipated that they'd find one gene per protein. But in fact, they found significantly less than that. They found around 23,600, almost 23,700 genes, which happened to be the same as a microscopic roundworm. Okay, when you look at our genes, we pretty much look the same as a worm. What's the difference, right? So the DNA is the raw information or instructions of who we are and what we are. But the DNA produces proteins, and it's the combination of proteins that allow for expression of how our body is functioning. So we can have 100,000 different proteins plus 40,000 different regulatory proteins, and these combinations are what make us much more complex than, say, a roundworm. So genes must work together in cooperation with one another so that many are expressed or turned on or upregulated, or suppressed or turned off or downregulated at the same time within a cell. So our genetic expression is made up of what's going on inside of the body, okay? So our emotional and biological and neurological and mental and energetic and even spiritual states of being, all of that contribute to how our genetic expression is coded and sequenced. And our genetic expression is also impacted by what's going on outside of our body. So if we've had any physical trauma, we've had temperature changes, altitude changes, if we've been exposed to toxins, bacteria, viruses, food, alcohol, so on and so forth. All of those pieces, outside and inside, impact our genetic expression and what genes are turned on or upregulated and what genes are turned off or downregulated. Are those genes inflammatory, or are those genes expressive in terms of vitalistic and health? So let's take a pause here, because what we're finding, and a lot of this information comes from a book called You Are the Placebo by Dr. Joe Dispenza. And his personal experience, in addition to tons of research and his background, have led him to understand the importance of the mind-body connection. And so I'd like to share his personal story that started his journey into, you know, this research and this mind-body connection, and we'll bring it back to how it relates to epigenetics. So Dr. Joe Dispenza, he is a chiropractor, and he was 23 when he was in a triathlon. He was competing in a triathlon. He had just finished his swimming portion and hopped on his bicycle and was doing the biking portion. And he said he was coming down this hill, and as they turned the corner, they were merging with traffic. And so he was watching the police officer signaled him to go. So he turned a sharp corner, merged with traffic, and there was a woman driving an SUV Bronco that didn't see him and hit him. Okay, so hit him. He flew 20 feet, landed on his back, and the driver had such a slow reaction time that she actually hit him again. He grabbed onto the bumper so she wouldn't run over him, dragged him for another 20 feet, and when she finally was able to stop, he flew another, few feet. And so from that accident, he ended up with compression fractures. Now, compression fractures, you have your vertebrae that are stacked on each other. Compression is complete compression. The bones have nowhere to go in space. They shatter and they make up, they take up the space. So he had compression fractures from T8, so his mid-thoracic spine, all the way down to his first L1 vertebra or lumbar vertebra. And he went to multiple specialists, 3 different specialists, and all of them came back saying, you know what, Joe, you need Harrington rod surgery. There is no way your body or your spine will ever be able to maintain your weight in a seated or standing position. And this is the only way you will be able to, come out of this injury. Now, Harrington rods are just that. They're rods that they, attach the spine above and below the compression fractures so that you can, maintain your weight. Well, Joe, having the background he did as a chiropractor, said, you know what, that doesn't interest me. I'm going to see if there's an alternative. So at 23, after this major accident and injury, he moves in with a friend unable to be seated. He's laying on his stomach or his back during the day. And he decides he is going to reconstruct his spine with his mind, step by step, every day. And he's going to see if he can engage this level of consciousness to support recovery and healing. And he talked about how he had a challenge with being able to go through this process, because oftentimes when we are in this state, we think worst case scenario, and what could happen and what we don't want to happen just floods into the brain. He starts thinking about what the surgeons told him, what life looks like if he doesn't have the surgery. And so he said it was really challenging to engage in this process and go inside, reconstruct, and just quiet all the noise. And he said it took him about 6 weeks to go from start to finish to completely reconstruct his spine. And he said when he did that, it was like something clicked into place, where, you know, there was no noise, and it was just connecting to his body, allowing for his mind to support the process. And he said at that time, he thought, what if I engaged my emotions and energy into the process? And so he started thinking about what life would be like to be back walking and running and being with his friends and having dinner out at restaurants and being able to take a shower. And he said he thought about the minute details and appreciated the experience and the excitement for what could be. And long story short, 9.5 weeks after the accident, he was up, moving around, completely healed, completely back to his life pre-accident. At 10 weeks post-accident, he was back in chiropractic, adjusting and taking care of his patients. And, you know, this is 40 years later. Now he says, you know, I really haven't experienced back pain since, completely healed from compression fractures. And he was told by specialists that, you know, his only options were surgery. So why do I bring this up? Because when we talk about the study of epigenetics, your headspace and your thoughts and your belief systems are a part of the inside internal environment of how your genetics express themselves, which is really amazing. So let's jump into these thoughts here. So we think about 60 to 70,000 thoughts in one day, and 90%, I've seen some other research, 95% of those thoughts are the exact same thoughts we had the day before. So day after day after day, we're having 90+% of our thoughts the same thoughts. So let's just take a pause here, because if we are thinking the same thoughts, what are those thoughts, right? This is why it takes so long to change a habit. But let's just think about the body here. If we believe that our body needs help from the outside, if we don't love how we look, if we have an internal chatter that is negative or is fear-based, or, you know, is really one that is not supportive and really hateful thoughts, how do you think a body will express itself? What types of genes do you think will be turned on and turned off based on those thoughts? And we're talking thoughts that last over a lifetime, right? So how does that happen? We get up on the same side of the bed, we go through the same routine in the bathroom, comb our hair the same way, we sit in the same chair, hold our mug with the same hand, we drive the same route to the same job, do the same things we know how to do well with the same people who push the same emotional buttons every day. We do the same things over and over and over and over. And so it can be really challenging to start changing, especially if this is internal chatter and there's a major mind-body connection. And that mind-body connection impacts, what's going on inside of the body and outside of the body. When you're talking about expressing health, it's really a intentional job of changing it. So our state of being, Dr. Joe talks about our state of being. So where we currently are based off the same thoughts we have day in and day out that contribute to the same choices we make day in and day out. And therefore we have and make the same actions and have the same behaviors and have the same experiences that bring us to the same feelings. Okay. So if we want to change the state of being, it can be challenging. It's doable. It's possible. Dr. Joe, he healed compression fractures in his spine in 9.5 weeks. We can change. It just takes work. So when you have this state of being, the brain and the body stays the same. And so my question for you is, what does this mean for your life? If you're thinking the same thoughts today that you think tomorrow leads to the same experience in the future, what does that mean in terms of your health and well-being, right? If you want to experience life in a different way, it's going to take a different starting point, right? It's going to take different thoughts and make different choices, right? So let's talk about the brain. Okay, so the brain made up of 75% water. It's like the consistency of a soft-boiled egg. This is why water and hydrating are so important. Is because your body is made up of quite a bit of water, but your brain is also made up of significant amounts of water. And your brain is made up of 100 billion neurons, which are nerve cells. And let me just see. I wanted to find something in the book that went into detail here about the brain. But a nerve cell, I want you to think about nerve cell or neuron. It's like this giant elastic oak tree, leafless, and it's got these wriggly branches and root systems that connect and disconnect to other nerve cells. So you have this massive oak tree connected to all of these other massive oak trees. And this is what Dr. Joe says. So we used to think of the brain as a computer. And while there are certainly some similarities, we now know that there's much more to the story. Each neuron is its own unique biocomputer with more than 60 megabytes of RAM. It's capable of processing enormous amounts of data, up to hundreds of thousands of functions per second. As we learn new things and have new experiences in our lives, our neurons make new connections, exchanging electrochemical information with each other. Those connections are called synaptic connections because the place where the cells exchange information, the gap between the branch of one neuron and the root of another, is called a synapse. So if learning is making new synaptic connections, then remembering is keeping those connections wired together. So in effect, a memory is a long-term relationship or connection between nerve cells. And the creation of these connections and the ways they change over time alters the physical structure of the brain. And as the brain makes these changes, our thoughts produce a blend of various chemicals called neurotransmitters. And we think thoughts, neurotransmitters at one branch of one neuron tree cross the synaptic gap to reach the root of another neuron tree. Once they cross that gap, the neuron fires with an electrical bolt of information. And when we continue thinking the same thoughts, the neuron keeps firing the same way, strengthening that relationship between the two cells so that they can more readily convey a signal the next time those neurons fire. So as a result, the brain shows physical evidence that something was not only learned, but remembered. So I can go into much more detail, but understand that, and research is showing that moment by moment, our brain is changing depending on our experience and what we're learning and remembering in our memory, right? It's amazing. New thoughts, you become changed neurologically, chemically, and genetically. You can gain thousands of new connections in matters of seconds from novel learning, new ways of thinking, and fresh experiences. That means thought alone can personally activate new genes right away. It happens by changing your mind. Fascinating. It's amazing. And you can also see neurons that fire together, wire together. And so to continue to change and allow for the brain to expand and create these new synapses and new wiring, you need to continue to reinforce it, right? And that's where, going back to this piece, having 60 to 70,000 thoughts in one day, 90% of those are the same. To change that takes consistency, intention, and work, but it's possible. It's possible. So I'm going to read you one more thing from the book, which I find to be so amazing, just to inspire you to know that your genes don't predetermine, they predispose. And when you start making different choices, when you start on your health journey, you're changing your outcome. You're changing how your genes express themselves, which is really powerful and amazing, and so worthwhile. So listen to this, because I think that it's never too late. As long as we are living and breathing, we have this potential to better express health and well-being. And this research was done back in 1981. They had a group of 8 men in their 70s and 80s. Okay, and they were going to take part in a 5-day retreat where they were asked to pretend that they were young again, or at least 22 years younger than they were at the time. Okay. And this group of researchers would take another group of 8 elderly men at the same place, to the same place the following week. And the men in the second group were asked to actively reminisce about being 22 years younger, but not pretend that they weren't their current age. So let's look at what happened with the first group. When the first group of men arrived, they found themselves surrounded by all sorts of environmental cues to help them recreate an earlier age. They flipped through old issues of Life and the Saturday Evening Post. They watched movies and TV shows popular in 1959, and they listened to recordings of Perry Como and Nat King Cole on the radio. They also talked about current events such as Fidel Castro's rise to power in Cuba, Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev's visit to the United States, and even the feats of baseball star Mickey Mantle and boxing great Floyd Patterson. All of these elements were cleverly designed to help the men imagine that they were really 22 years younger. After each 5-day retreat, the researchers looked at several measurements and compared them to those they'd taken before the start of the study. The bodies of the men from both groups were physiologically younger, structurally as well as functionally, right? So the first group were men who were asked to reminisce, and the second group were asked to pretend. The researchers, they go on to say, the bodies of the men from both groups were younger and structurally and functionally, although those in the study who pretended to be younger improved significantly more. The researchers discovered improvements in height, weight, and gait. The men grew taller as their posture straightened, their joints became more flexible, and their fingers lengthened as their arthritis diminished. Their eyesight and hearing got better, their grip strength improved, their memory sharpened, and they scored better on tests of mental cognition. The men literally became younger in those 5 days right in front of the researchers' eyes. One of the researchers said, at the end of the study, I was playing football, touch, but still football with these men, some of who gave up their canes. How did that happen? Clearly, men were able to turn on circuits in their brain and remind them of who they had been 20 years ago, and their body chemistry responded. They didn't just feel younger, they physically became younger. The change wasn't just in their mind, the change was in their bodies. Isn't that amazing? So I think this is really an empowering conversation. And how does it relate to your chiropractic care? Okay. Subluxation, right? Subluxation is what we're looking for in your spine. Subluxation alters the information going in from your environment and causes brain stress, creates an inability to adapt to your environment, and creates poor neurological patterning. So if you have subluxation, it contributes to poor processing of your environment, poor response to your environment, and potentially your genetic expression, the genes you're turning on, genes you're turning off, right? It's an inflammatory state. So we want to address and evaluate where those subluxations are. We want to correct and adjust your subluxations, which changes brain function, improves neuroplasticity, and improves how you respond to your environment, which is super cool. You go from an inflammatory state to an anti-inflammatory state. And you are in a care plan that's written for you to succeed, right? We talk about adjustments, and we want to add in all of these pieces through spinal workshops and exercise, movement, mindfulness, breathing. As you become a more informed consumer, guess what happens? Your thoughts start to change. Your behaviors and actions start to change. You start to do things that put you more towards health as opposed to disease. And we see physical structure change. We see thought patterns change. We change your external environment. We change your internal environment. And guess what? That turns genes on, that turns genes off, so that you can experience more vitality, longevity, and a higher level of expression of life. So I love this conversation on epigenetics. It is empowering, but it requires a responsibility. It requires you to take a look at what is the environment I grew up in? What are my thoughts? What are my choices? How do I take care of myself on a day-to-day basis, both mind and body? And guess what? You can change that. I can change that. It just takes work, and it's an investment. And I am here to partner with you every step of the way. When you invest in yourself, guess what? I'm invested right there with you, and I will support you and partner with you to support your best expression of health. Because guess what? That's what I'm doing for me. I'm doing that for me every day, trying to make better decisions that impact my health, but also my families and my communities. So appreciate you are part of this conversation, and know that every time you get adjusted, every time you show up to the office, you are contributing to a behavior and a choice and an action that is turning on genes that are healthy, vitalistic, and supporting a brain that can better respond and adapt to stress. So love and appreciate you. I hope you guys have, a great rest of your day, and love to hear your takeaways when you're in the office. So thank you for spending your time with you. We'll see you next time.